The acrid scent hit the Cathar first, stinging their delicate respiratory membranes. A plume of thick, dark smoke billowed upwards, twisting like a malevolent serpent against the alien sky. Captain Zilar's multiple ocular stalks swiveled wildly, trying to pinpoint the source. Fire! The universal translator shrieked the word in his mind, echoing the panicked screeches of his crew. Alert! Alert! Uncontained thermal reaction detected at Sector GAM-MA7. Threat level! Catastrophic! A bridge officer squawked, its chitinous plates rattling with terror. On the main view screen, the source became horrifyingly clear, a raging inferno, consuming a small patch of strange, fibrous plant life. The heat's signature flared, an angry orange-red blotch on their instruments. Zylar had never seen anything like it. His species, like most galactic civilizations, had long ago mastered energy suppression. Fire was an ancient, primitive, destructive force, relegated to historical archives and horror simulations. To witness it none a person Kansa was to stare into the maw of primeval chaos. His mandibles clacked together, a sign of extreme distress. Initiate atmospheric containment protocols. Deploy rapid response suppression units. This cannot be allowed to spread. Below, in the encampment designated for the human delegation, the scene unfolding was an entirely different kind of madness. While the Cathar bridge was a symphony of alarms and frantic commands, the humans were calm. Impossibly, unnervingly calm. A small group of them, barely a dozen, sat gathered around a contained pit, from which the very fire Zylar was battling emanated. They weren't fighting it. They were feeding it, tossing in more of the strange, woody plant material. A large human, with coarse hair and a face smudged with soot, knelt closest. He held a long, sharpened stick. At the end of the stick, impaled, was a puffy, white object. He rotated it slowly over the flames, the heat making the white surface bubble and turn golden brown. "Another one, Jarek?" A smaller human called out, their voice completely devoid of the terror Zylar expected. "Almost ready, Mia," the large human Jarek replied, his voice a low rumble. He pulled the stick back, the roasted confection perfectly toasted. He bit into it, a slow, deliberate movement, a faint smile playing on his lips. Perfect. Zylar zoomed the screen in, his sensory inputs struggling to reconcile the data. The humans were consuming something that had been exposed to the uncontrolled thermal reaction. They were Triet. His tactical officer, a creature known for its logical, dispassionate analysis, chittered nervously. "Captain, their physiological readings, they show no signs of distress. No elevated heart rate, no adrenaline surge. In fact, their neural activity indicates pleasure, euphoria even." The Kafer captain watched as Jarek offered a similar stick, topped with a fresh white orb, to another human. The human accepted it, a quiet acknowledgement passing between them. No fear, no panic, just a shared moment. With fire, a chilling realization began to creep into Zylar's multi-lobed brain. These creatures, these humans, who lived on a death world, who seemed to thrive on chaos, perhaps their immunity extended beyond radiation, beyond biological warfare, beyond the vacuum of space. Perhaps they were simply immune to fear itself. How else could they sit so serenely beside a primal force of destruction, treating it as a source of warmth and food? It was a terrifying thought. The scent of power, indeed. Captain Zylar's primary optical stalks narrowed, focusing with an almost painful intensity on the human encampment below. The bridge was still awash with the muted hum of emergency protocols, but the frantic urgency had dulled. His crew, though still visibly rattled, were now merely observing, their multi-jointed limbs stiff with a mixture of confusion and a primal, unfamiliar dread. The fire suppression units he'd dispatched hovered uselessly, their molecular stabilizers unable to affect a phenomenon they couldn't comprehend. "Captain," chirped his tactical officer Zilk, its voice a strained vibration, "the humans continue to engage with the uncontrolled thermal event. Our thermal sensors indicate localized surface temperatures exceeding 700 K, yet their physiological readings remain stable. Stable, Captain. This defies all known biological responses to direct exposure to hazardous energy." Zylar waved a dismissive appendage. "I observe. More troubling is their interaction with it." He zoomed the main view screen again. The large human, Jarek, was now demonstrating the roasting technique to a younger human, a smaller biped with bright, inquisitive eyes. Jarek patiently guided the stick, tipped with its puffy white treat, into the flickering orange-red heart of the flame. The smaller human watched, utterly captivated, not by fear, but by expectation. When the confection turned a deep caramel brown, Jarek pulled it back, blowing gently on it before handing it over. The child human, without hesitation, bit into it, a faint MMPH sound escaping its lips. Analysis of the consumable item, Zilek. Zilek commanded, his voice barely a whisper. What is it? What purpose does it serve? Zilk's data feeds scrolled rapidly across a secondary screen. Initial analysis suggests a complex organic polymer, highly saccharine, with a porous internal structure. The roasting process induces a chemical caramelization, altering texture and flavor profile. Purpose appears to be for gustatory pleasure, Captain. Gustatory pleasure. With fire. The very thing Xylar's species had painstakingly eliminated from their existence, these humans were using for pleasure. This wasn't just a lack of fear. This was an embrace. A perversion of natural caution. One of the ship's cultural anthropologists, a wise old thorax, shuffled forward, its energy field shimmering with unease. Captain, forgive my interjection, but this behavior, it reflects a fundamental difference in their species' relationship with danger. We, and indeed most advanced civilizations, eradicate threats. Humans, they seem to incorporate them. They domesticate the very forces that would destroy them, turning them into tools, even sources of comfort. Xylar watched as another human tossed a small log onto the fire, sending a shower of sparks upwards, momentarily illuminating their faces. They laughed, a deep, rumbling sound that seemed to mock the Cathar's elaborate precautions. So they start fires on purpose, Xylar muttered, his mandibles clicking. They deliberately bring forth destruction, just to eat something over it. It isn't immunity to fear, Zelk. It's a complete redefinition of it. A revolution of perspective, where danger isn't something to avoid, but something to master for a trivial reward. He looked at the roasting marshmallow, now perfectly golden in the human's hand. The taste of revolution. It was sickening and utterly terrifying. A species that could tame primal chaos for a sugary treat. What couldn't they do? The flickering light from the human encampment pulsed on Captain Xylar's bridge, a mesmerizing, terrifying beacon in the twilight of the alien world. His multiple ocular stalks were locked onto the source, the uncontrolled thermal event that his ship's advanced systems had failed to suppress. It had become clear, agonizingly clear, that suppression wasn't the objective for these bewildering creatures called humans. For them, it was comfort. Still no escalation in the thermal reaction, Captain, Zilek reported, its voice carefully modulated, betraying none of the initial panic. The humans maintain the event within its designated containment area. Their fire remains stable. Stable. Xylar found the word almost insulting. How could something so inherently destructive be stable? His species had spent millennia purging their homeworld of such volatile forces. Yet, below, the humans treated it like a pet. A pet that could devour an entire forest, given the chance. He zoomed in again. The group around the fire was larger now. More humans had emerged from their curious shelters, drawn by the dancing light and the low, crackling sounds that Xylar's universal translator identified as laughter and song. They weren't fighting the fire, they were sharing its diet. One human, elderly by galactic biological standards, sat closest to the embers, its face illuminated by the ruddy glow. It held its multi-fingered hands towards the warmth, a look of profound contentment on its wrinkled features. The air around them, even at this distance, carried a faint, sweet, smoky scent. Not the acrid stench of uncontrolled burning, but something earthy. Inviting, almost. Their vital signs remain baffling, Zeke continued, a hint of scientific frustration now creeping into its tone. Their dermal temperature registers slightly elevated, well within their comfort zone. They're experiencing the heat, Captain, but not perceiving it as a threat. Instead, their neural patterns suggest relaxation, camaraderie, a sense of belonging. Xylar watched the sparks leap and vanish into the cool night air. The humans weren't just roasting their saccharine treats anymore. They were conversing, their voices a soft murmur, punctuated by the snap and hiss of burning wood. One human was strumming a stringed instrument, producing melodic vibrations that were utterly alien yet strangely compelling. The fire wasn't just heat and light. It was a focal point, a gathering place. The wise old thorax anthropologist from earlier projected an image onto a secondary screen, a primitive depiction of a human ancestor, huddled around a similar fire, surrounded by hulking, predatory beasts. Captain, observe. For their ancestors, fire was protection, survival. It kept the darkness and its dangers at bay. It cooked their food, hardened their tools. It was their first true mastery over their environment. Xylar's visual stalks flickered. So this is not a new behavior. This is an asterisk instinct, a foundational component of their very being. Indeed, the thorax confirmed. They carry the burden of those ancient embers, Captain, not as a weight, but as a legacy. A comfort. They trust fire, despite its inherent destructive potential. They've learned to control it, to channel its power, and in doing so they've woven it into the fabric of their existence. Below, the large human Jarek tossed another log onto the flames. The fire roared up, a brief, defiant surge of orange and red, then settled back into its rhythmic dance. The humans didn't flinch. They simply leaned in closer, bathed in the warmth and light, their faces etched with a profound, almost primitive peace. For them, the embers weren't a threat to be managed. They were home. And that, Xylar realized, was perhaps the most unsettling human truth of all. They carried the raw power of destruction, not as a burden, but as a deeply comforting, essential part of who they were. The alien night deepened, cloaking the landscape in shadows, but the human encampment pulsed with a steady, defiant glow. From his observation deck, Captain Xylar's multifaceted eyes tracked the shifting patterns of the flames. Most of the humans had retreated into their curious, soft-sided shelters, leaving only a handful around the fire pit. Yet the fire itself never faltered. Monitoring sustained thermal output, Captain. Zilk, as voice drifted from the console. The energy readings are remarkably consistent, despite dwindling fuel input. It appears they are managing the burn rate with precision, even at this hour. Xylar watched. One human, a lean figure, sat cross-legged near the embers. Its head occasionally dipped, then snapped back up. A guardian, he realized. A sentinel over the controlled conflagration. The rhythmic crackle of the fire was the only sound accompanying the human's quiet vigil. The earlier laughter and music had long faded, replaced by the soft whisper of the burning wood. His species had spent cycles observing various primitive civilizations, noting their need for security, for light, for warmth against the dark. But those needs were met with advanced, energy-efficient solutions. Not with a ravenous consuming entity. Not with Tanrus fire. As the long night cycle wore on, Xylar observed a subtle shift. The lean human, after several planetary rotations, roused another from a nearby shelter. A quiet exchange occurred, gestures passing between them. Then, the first human retired, and the second took its place beside the dancing flames. A rotation. A duty. The watch. The new watcher, a human with bundled coverings against the chill, picked up a sturdy stick. With practiced ease, they poked at the glowing coals, scattering faint, fleeting sparks into the darkness. A fresh, small log was carefully placed, coaxing the embers back into a stronger, brighter flame. It wasn't about simply keeping the fire alive, it was about nurturing it. Their biological metrics remain constant, Captain, Zilek reported, its tone laced with a familiar bewilderment. No signs of fatigue-induced stress, no anxiety. Even in this vulnerable state, watching over a self-sustaining destructive force, their neural pathways indicate a state of mindful calm. mindful calm. Xylar considered the concept. For the Cathar, anything requiring constant vigilance was a source of tension, a drain on resources. Yet, for humans, this nightly vigil, this tending of the dangerous embers, seemed to be almost a meditative act. It was as if they were performing an ancient, instinctual ritual, one deeply embedded in their psyche. The Thrax anthropologist, ever present during these observations, offered a thoughtful insight. "Captain, consider the implications. This isn't merely about warmth or protection from unseen predators. This is about trust. Trust in their own ability to control the uncontrollable. To harness the rawest power of their world, not just for survival, but for continuity. For the simple, comforting act of seeing the sun rise over a fire they themselves kept alive." Xylar watched the human guardian, illuminated by the rhythmic glow. The fire wasn't just a tool. It was an extension of their will, a testament to their defiance against the indifferent cosmos. They weren't immune to fear because they didn't understand danger. They were immune to fear because they faced danger, embraced it, and then made it their servant. The rhythm of their watch was the beat of a species that saw a raging inferno, not as an ending, but as a promise they meticulously kept. Through the darkest hours, the alien sun, a pale, distant orb, cast long, weak shadows across the Cathar observation deck. But Captain Xylar's gaze wasn't on the celestial body. It was, as it had been for cycles, fixed on the human encampment below. The controlled thermal event, the cycle, was still alive, pulsing with a deep orange heart, even in the morning light. His crew, accustomed now to its persistent presence, merely monitored, their initial panic replaced by a profound, almost philosophical bewilderment. "Energy output remains stable, Captain." Zillick droned, its multiple data feeds scrolling monotonously. "The humans appear to be maintaining the burn at a consistent low level. They continue to add small increments of fuel at irregular intervals." Xylar waved a dismissive appendage. "I observe, Zilk. But tell me, what purpose does this Tindlon serve?" He zoomed the view screen. A small group of humans was gathered around the now smaller, but still fiercely glowing, fire pit. One human, younger than most, held a slender, elongated piece of metal. It wasn't pointed. It had a strange, flattened tip. This human was tracing lines in the ash and dirt around the fire's edge, occasionally dipping the metal tip into a small container. Then the human dipped the tip directly into a dying ember. A small puff of smoke rose, and the tip glowed with a faint, ephemeral red. The human then began to make marks on a flat, pale surface, not the ground this time, but a thin, flexible sheet of processed plant fiber. As the glowing tip touched the surface, it left a dark, smudged line. "They are utilizing the residual carbon, Captain," Zellick reported, its voice tinged with scientific curiosity, "the byproduct of the thermal reaction. They are creating two-dimensional representations. We observe similar behaviors in early-stage sentient species, but typically with less volatile materials." But then the activity shifted. The human with the metal stylus put it aside. Another human, this one with rough, calloused hands, reached into the fire itself with a pair of long, metallic tongs. With painstaking precision, they extracted a glowing piece of wood, a small, smoldering ember, and placed it carefully on a heat-resistant surface near the fire. The first human, the artist, knelt beside it. They held a different tool now, a thin, pointed stick. They began to manipulate the ember, nudging it, separating smaller, glowing fragments. And then, a third human, with quick, fluid movements, began to fan the embers with a wide, flat object. The effect was instantaneous and mesmerizing. As air hit the smoldering wood, sparks erupted, tiny, incandescent specks dancing upwards, catching the ambient light and painting fleeting trails in the air. The humans watched, utterly captivated. The artist human then used their pointed stick to arrange the embers into shapes, creating patterns of glowing orange against the dull gray ash. With a gentle puff of breath, they could make a section flare brighter, a tiny, controlled explosion of light. They are creating temporary illuminations, the thorax anthropologist mused, its energy field pulsing. They are shaping the light itself. Not just for warmth or utility, but for aesthetic experience, for wonder. Xylar watched as the artist human, satisfied with a pattern of embers, resembling a cluster of small stars, looked up at the others. A wide, genuine smile spread across their face. The other humans smiled back. This wasn't just resilience. It was an innate, inexplicable joy derived from interacting with the very forces that should inspire terror. They weren't just immune to fear, they found beauty in its rawest form. They were painting with light, and in doing so, painting a portrait of their own indomitable spirit. The alien night had fully descended, thick and oppressive, broken only by the persistent, defiant glow of the human fire below. On Captain Xylar's bridge, a strange quiet had settled. The Cathar crew still monitored, but the frantic energy of their initial panic had been replaced by a weary, almost resigned acceptance of the humans' peculiar thermal obsession. Their fire, once a source of terror, was now merely background noise. Until now, suddenly a jolt, not from the fire. A high-pitched, insistent alarm shrilled through the bridge. Xyloc, multiple data feeds flared scarlet, indicators screaming a very different kind of warning. Captain! Detecting large, unregistered biosignature, originating from the outer perimeter, rapidly approaching sector GAM-MA7. Threat assessment. Unknown, but highly aggressive. Xylar's ocular stalks swiveled, his internal sensors vibrating with a primal unease. This was a primus stursfret, an uncontrolled biological entity, not a controlled thermal reaction. His species knew fear. This was it. Shields up. Prepare defensive arrays. What is it, Xyloc? Classification? Before Xyloc could respond, a low, guttural growl echoed from the planet's surface. A sound that vibrated through the Cathar ship's hull. Alien and predatory. It was a sound that made Xylar's chitinous plates prickle. It came from the dense, thorny foliage just beyond the human encampment. On the main view screen, the humans around their fire paused. The artist human, who moments ago had been shaping glowing embers, froze, their head cocked. Jarek, the large human, slowly straightened, his eyes scanning the inky blackness beyond their flickering light. No one screamed. No one scattered. The growl came again, closer this time, accompanied by the distinct, trees snap of alien branches breaking. A shadow, larger than anything natural on this planet, seemed to ripple at the very edge of the fire's reach. "It's a Xylos beast, Captain," Xalk finally chittered, its voice laced with genuine terror. "Highly territorial. Known for extreme aggression and impenetrable hide. Its attack pattern, it's heading directly for the human encampment." Xylar watched, horrified. The humans were sitting targets. They couldn't possibly comprehend the danger. But then Jarek knelt, not reaching for a weapon, but for a hefty log near the fire. With a grunt, he heaved it onto the crackling flames. The fire roared, a sudden blinding surge of orange and red, pushing back the encroaching shadows. "Hey there, big guy!" Jarek's voice, amplified by the ship's sensitive audio pickup, was surprisingly calm, almost conversational. "Just enjoying a bit of a campfire, you know? Got some good heat here." The Xylos beast paused, its unseen form momentarily halted by the sudden flare of light. The other humans didn't huddle. Instead, one of them picked up a guitar and began to strum a rhythmic, almost defiant tune. Another human, the small child, pointed a stick at the now brighter flames, a simple, unadulterated curiosity in its eyes. Xylar felt his internal processors seize. They weren't panicking, they weren't fleeing. They were confronting a lethal predator, not with weapons, but with a louder fire and a song. They used the very force that had terrified his advanced civilization to stand their ground against a primal, undeniable threat. They didn't fear the voice in the shadows. They sang to it, and dared it to step into their light. It wasn't immunity to fear, Xylar realized. It was something far more terrifying. A refusal to let fear dictate anything. The growl of the Xylos beast had faded into the alien night, But the memory lingered on Captain Zylar's bridge, a phantom tremor in the ship's hull. The threat indicators for the biosignature had receded, but not vanished. The creature was still out there, lurking beyond the humans, audacious firelight. What truly remained, however, was a profound, unsettling silence among the Cathar crew. Their advanced defenses had been on high alert, ready for a fight, only to witness humans, armed with nothing but flames and folk songs, successfully deterring a territorial apex predator. "The Xylos beast has withdrawn beyond effective detection range, Captain," Zillick reported, its voice flat, devoid of its earlier panic. No discernible damage to the human encampment. Their thermal reaction remains stable. Stable. Zylar's optical stalks narrowed, focusing on the camp below. The fire, now a bright, crackling heart against the pre-dawn gloom, felt different. It was no longer just a source of warmth or light or curious treats. It was a shield. And now, it seemed, it was becoming something more. The large human, Jarek, stood by the fire, no longer singing or roasting. In his hands, he held a long, thick branch, stripped of bark. The younger human, Mia, stood beside him, watching intently. Jarek didn't toss the branch into the heart of the flames. Instead, he carefully angled one end of it, pushing the tip into the hottest, glowing embers. A faint hiss rose from the wood as the direct heat met its fibers. The Cathar sensors registered a rapid, localized charring, the organic material turning black and hardened. Jarek rotated the stick slowly, ensuring an even exposure. The pungent scent of burning wood, sharper than before, wafted up to the ship's environmental sensors. "What is he doing?" Zylar whispered, his internal processors struggling to rationalize this new activity. "Is he destroying the fuel supply?" "Negative, Captain," Zylek chirped, its data feeds analyzing the process with frantic precision. "The human is not consuming the wood. He is altering its structural integrity. The intense heat causes rapid dehydration and carbonization of the outer layers. This process, it increases the material's density and resistance to blunt force trauma." The wise old Thrax anthropologist projected an image from their vast historical database. Primitive spears, their tips dark and sharpened, used by ancient, pre-galactic civilizations. "Captain, they are fire-hardening the tip of a projectile. They are turning a simple branch into a more effective weapon." Jarek pulled the stick from the fire. The tip was now dark, almost black, with a glistening, hardened sheen. He tested it against a loose rock, the charred point scraping a surprisingly deep furrow. He then handed it to Mia, who gripped it firmly, her eyes wide. She looked from the hardened stick to the shadowy perimeter, where the Xylos beast had lurked, then back at the fire. A grim, determined look settled on her young face. The other humans, roused by the dawn, were now replicating the process, preparing their own hardened tips, not just for protection, but for the inherent ability to strike back. The fire, once a symbol of their strange comfort, was now revealed as an active, potent force in their survival. It wasn't just fear they were immune to. They were immune to helplessness. They found power in the very embers that others would flee, turning their warmth into a cutting edge. And in that raw, primal act, Zylar saw a truth far more chilling than any monster. Humans didn't just survive. They adapted, they improvised, and they turned every element of their world, even its raw destruction, into a tool for their enduring will. The morning sun was a cold lie. Captain Zylar felt the lingering chill of the night, not just from the ship's vents, but from the unsettling reality of the humans below. They had faced a creature of pure, territorial aggression, and instead of relying on advanced defenses, they'd thrown a bigger log on the fire and made hardened sticks. But their innovation hadn't stopped with wood. It never did. Jarek, the large human, was busy again, orchestrating a new ritual around their persistent fire pit. He and several others were now carefully placing a collection of smooth, fist-sized stones directly into the hottest glowing heart of the flames. The stones began to darken, then pulsed with an internal, angry red as they absorbed the immense heat. The air above the pit shimmered, distorted by the radiating warmth, and the crackle of the fire took on a deeper, more resonant note. Mia, the young human, watched with rapt attention, occasionally adding small twigs to fuel the flames, her face flushed from the intense heat, her eyes wide with curiosity, not fear. "Captain," Zylake's voice was now a constant weary companion, laced with an almost philosophical resignation. "The humans are introducing silicate-based geological formations into the thermal event. Thermal sensors indicate internal temperatures approaching 1000 K. There is a high probability of structural failure and fragmentation." Zylar bristled. Fragments of superheated rock? This was beyond reckless. This was deliberately courting danger, not just for survival but for some unknown purpose. After what felt like an eternity, but was barely a handful of standard minutes, Jarek used long, thick branches as crude tongs. With immense care, he maneuvered one of the glowing incandescent stones out of the fire. It sizzled on the damp ground, wisps of steam rising from its surface, the heat radiating in palpable waves. He then directed the other humans to stand back with a sharp, almost primal gesture. With a powerful grunt, he took a bucket of water and, without hesitation, poured it over the scorching hot stone. A sharp, violent toss ripped through the alien air, a sound of immense thermal shock. Immediately, it was followed by a deafening sea rack that echoed across the clearing. The stone fractured, splitting cleanly into several jagged pieces, revealing a crystalline interior that still steamed faintly. The force of the thermal shock was immense, sending smaller fragments skittering across the dirt. "Unbelievable," Zylek chittered, its data feed struggling to keep up with the crude yet effective process. "Thermal shock fracturing!" A highly primitive, yet demonstrably effective, method of altering geological structure. They are intentionally creating weaknesses within the stone to facilitate breakage, Captain. Without any advanced tooling, they are shaping the very rock. The wise old Thrax anthropologist, its energy field shimmering with a new depth of awe, spoke slowly. "They are shaping their environment, Captain. Not with energy fields or molecular resequencers, but with fundamental forces. Fire and water. Creation through controlled destruction. They see a lump of raw rock and immediately understand how to break it down, to mold it to their will. This isn't just adaptation. It's an intrinsic, relentless drive to overcome, to build, to never be limited by what they are given." Zylar stared at the shattered stone, then at the humans, already gathering the newly formed fragments, their faces grimly satisfied. Their ingenuity wasn't about pushing boundaries of technology. It was about pushing the boundaries of sheer raw will. They didn't just endure fire. They forced it to build their world, one brutal, elemental crack at a time. This was humanity's true, terrifying weapon, the relentless spirit to bend reality itself. A guttural, world-shaking tremor rattled Captain Zylar's bridge, knocking unsecured equipment from its mounts. Alarms shrieked anew, a cacophony that ripped through the fragile calm that had settled on the Cathar vessel. This wasn't the familiar, localized panic of a thermal event. This was something far deeper, far more primal. Seismic activity, unprecedented magnitude. Zylek's voice was a high-pitched rasp, its data feeds flashing violently. Massive subterranean movement detected, originating kilometers away, rapidly approaching the human encampment. The floor vibrated beneath Zylar's multiple feet. His ocular stalks strained against the ship's internal stabilizers, focusing on the main view screen. The ground on the alien world below them buckled and heaved. Trees, ancient and colossal, toppled in slow motion, their roots tearing free with sickening wet snaps. A plume of dust, thick and choking, rose like a storm cloud on the horizon. "Captain, biosignature detected. Colossal in scale. Estimated mass, beyond anything in our databases. It's burrowing. It's coming from under them." Zylk screamed, its usually precise analytical voice shattering with terror. Below, the human encampment was a pinpoint of light against the unfolding chaos. The fire, their constant companion, pulsed brightly. Jarek, the large human, was no longer roasting or hardening sticks. He was standing, feet spread, a fire-hardened spear clutched in his hand. Mia, the young human, was no longer merely watching. She was being herded behind Jarek by another human, a tight grip on her shoulder. No screams. No frantic scrambling. Just focused, grim anticipation. The ground around the human fire pit began to crack, deep fissures spiderwebbing across the dirt. A low, grinding rumble filled the air, a sound of massive rock and earth being pulverized. Then, with an explosion of soil and debris, it erupted. It wasn't a beast of flesh and blood in the traditional sense, but a monstrous, segmented construct of chitin and stone, hundreds of meters long. Its multiple drilling appendages churned, tearing through the earth. Its single colossal maw, lined with jagged crystal teeth, was a cavern of destruction. It was the Land Eater, an ancient, geological terror, a force of nature made manifest. It rose from the earth, shaking the air with its immense, deafening roar, and its trajectory was undeniable, straight through the human camp. "Fire defensive arrays! Target its drilling appendages! Divert it!" Xylar barked, his voice filled with genuine fear, a chilling coldness creeping into his multiple hearts. His ship's powerful energy weapons charged, humming ominously. But the humans. They didn't wait for alien salvation. Jarek roared, a primal sound that cut through the Land Eater's thunderous approach. He didn't run. He charged. His fire-hardened spear, so puny against the monster's scale, was leveled with terrifying intent. Other humans, those who had spent the morning cracking stones, now held jagged, fire-sharpened rock fragments, their faces etched with a grim, unwavering resolve. The Xylos beast had been deterred by a song, and a brighter fire. The Land Eater laughed at such subtleties. Yet, the humans, facing utter annihilation, didn't cower. They didn't flee. They met the roar of an existential threat with their own, far smaller, but infinitely more defiant, battle cry. They used their primitive, fire-forged weapons to stand against a force that could obliterate them. This wasn't immunity to fear, Xylar realized, his ship's weapons charging uselessly. It was something far beyond, a species that refused to be consumed, even by the very ground beneath their feet. They didn't just face the impossible, they tried to stab it. The Land Eater didn't fall, but it recoiled. The colossal segmented beast, a force of nature made manifest, had been met not with advanced weaponry, but with a dozen screaming humans, their fire-hardened spears and jagged stone fragments glinting in the firelight. Jarek, the large human, had struck a vulnerable chitinous joint, a seemingly insignificant blow that nevertheless made the monster shudder. Confused, perhaps even mildly irritated by this unprecedented, suicidal resistance, the Land Eater roared once more, a sound now tinged with confusion more than menace, and burrowed back into the earth, leaving a scarred, trembling wake. A heavy silence descended on Captain Xylar's bridge. The seismic alarms died down, the biosignature of the Land Eater receding into the planet's mantle. His ship's defensive arrays, still humming with charged energy, had not fired. They hadn't needed to. Status report, Zilk. Xylar breathed, his multiple hearts thrumming with a mixture of profound relief and an even more profound disquiet. Human casualties, 0. Zilk chirped, its voice tinged with disbelief. Material damage to encampment, minimal. The fire. Captain, the fire is still burning. Xylar zoomed the view screen. Below, the humans were on their feet, not cheering, not celebrating wildly. They were grim-faced, exhausted, but intensely alive. Jarek was being helped by another human, a deep gash on his arm, a wound that would require immediate medical intervention for any Cathar. But Jarek merely nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon, then looking at Mia, the young human, who clung to another adult, trembling, but intact. The smell on the wind, picked up by the ship's environmental sensors, was heavy, scorched earth, pulverized rock, the metallic tang of alien dust. But underneath it, faint yet persistent, was the familiar, earthy scent of burning wood, still emanating from their resilient fire pit. Another human, after a moment of quiet reflection, knelt by the flickering flames, not to roast anything, not to harden a weapon. They carefully placed a small, thin branch into the heart of the fire, coaxing it to burn brighter. It was an act of renewal, a quiet testament to continuity. The Thrax anthropologist, its energy field shimmering with a new, humbling understanding, spoke. "Captain, we initially concluded humans were immune to fear because they embraced a destructive force. We were wrong. They feel fear. We saw it in their tightened muscles, their quickened pulses during the Xylos beast encounter, their grim determination against the Land-Eater. But they do not truly submit to it." Xylar watched as Jarek, his arm crudely bandaged by another human, walked over to the fire. He held his injured arm towards the warmth, his eyes fixed on the dancing flames. He looked tired, bruised, but utterly unbroken. The fire, which had been their comfort, their art, their weapon, was now once again their solace. "They do not run from the fire, Captain," the Thrax continued, its voice a low rumble. "They make fire their ally. And when faced with overwhelming terror, they don't flee the dark. They throw a bigger log on the fire and they stand their ground." Xylar finally understood. The initial panic, the marshmallows, the hardened tips, the confrontation, it was all the same thing. Humans weren't immune to fear. They simply channeled it. They took the fear, the anger, the sheer bloody-mindedness of survival, and they burned it, fueling their defiance. The smell of scorched earth, yes, but also the invisible scent of new growth, of resilient life planting roots, even in the ashes of the impossible. That was the raw, terrifying, utterly human truth. The raw gash on Jarek's arm pulsed with an angry red, a stark, visceral contrast to the dirt and soot clinging to his skin. Captain Xylar's internal system screamed for intervention, for medical protocols, for sterile environments and analgesic compounds. The Land-Eater had retreated, yes, but its passing had left a bleeding reminder, a searing testament to the sheer, physical vulnerability of these baffling creatures. "Captain, the human Jarek exhibits a deep laceration on his upper left forelimb. Xylek," his voice was tense, its multifaceted eyes fixed on the magnified view screen. "Tissue integrity compromised. Significant blood loss detected. Immediate medical intervention required for infection prevention and tissue regeneration. We have prepared sterile bandages and a broad-spectrum healing agent for deployment." Xylar flicked an optical stalk towards his tactical officer. "And their response? Are they requesting assistance?" His ship's medical bay was top of the line, ready to beam down emergency supplies at a moment's notice. But the humans made no such request. Jarek, though clearly in pain, his jaw was set, a faint tremor running through his muscular frame, didn't cry out. He didn't collapse. Instead, he simply knelt by the fire, his uninjured hand resting on the scarred earth. The fire, their omnipresent companion, crackled brightly, licking at the air. Mia, the young human, watched him with wide, solemn eyes, a silent witness to a very different kind of battle. Another human, a grim-faced woman, approached Jarek. In her hand, held with a thick, protective piece of cloth, was a stone. Not just any stone. It was one of the silicate fragments they had created through thermal shock, now heated again, glowing with an ominous dull red. The air around it shimmered with heat. Xylar felt a cold dread, far more potent than any fear of the Land-Eater, crawl up his multi-jointed spine. His medical readouts on Jarek's arm were horrifying enough. The gaping wound, the torn flesh. What were they doing? "Captain, their intention is unclear," Xylok whispered, its voice strained. "That stone's surface temperature exceeds 1000 K. Direct contact with epidermal tissue would result in catastrophic cellular damage, irreparable trauma." Jarek took a deep, shuddering breath. He looked at the glowing stone, then at the woman. A silent nod passed between them. Then, with a grunt that was more of grim acceptance than pain, he reached out his injured arm. The woman, with a swift, brutal efficiency, pressed the superheated stone directly onto the open wound. A primal gasp ripped through Xylar's bridge. A sharp, violent severs erupted from the camp, easily picked up by the ship's audio sensors, a sound of searing flesh and vaporized fluids. The smell, acrid and sickening, reached the ship's environmental filters. Burnt meat, charred skin, the unmistakable stench of agony. Jarek convulsed, his entire body tensing, but not a single scream escaped his lips. His head snapped back, his eyes squeezed shut, but he stayed upright, his free hand clenching a fistful of dirt. When the stone was finally pulled away, a cauterized scar hissed faintly on Jarek's arm, an ugly, blackened cauterization that sealed the wound. The blood flow had stopped. The pain, however, must have been unimaginable. The thorax anthropologist, its energy field pulsing erratically, finally spoke, its voice raspy. "They are cauterizing the wound, utilizing controlled thermal trauma to prevent further infection and blood loss. A barbaric, ancient practice, yet effective. They embrace the kiss of pain, Captain, not as a weakness but as a deliberate act of will, to inflict agony upon themselves, to deny a greater, more prolonged suffering. It is a terrifying, self-sacrificing resilience." Xylar watched Jarek, slumped against the fire pit, his breathing ragged but his eyes now open, clear and defiant. A sudden metallic tang filled Captain Xylar's internal atmosphere processors, followed by a dizzying lightheadedness. Zilk's respiratory membranes shuddered, and a high-pitched alarm, silent to the humans but screaming within the Cathar's internal communication network, blared across the bridge. "Atmospheric contaminant detected." Zilk's voice was strained, thick with developing hypoxia. "Localized pocket of an unknown heavy gas. Odorless, colorless, but rapidly displacing breathable atmosphere in sector GAMMA7. Threat level, extreme. Respiratory failure imminent for unprepared organisms." Xylar felt his multiple hearts race, his vision blurring at the edges. This was a nightmare. An invisible, insidious killer. And its source? His ocular stalks instinctively darted to the human encampment below. The fire, their omnipresent, persistent fire, seemed to flicker, its flames momentarily dimming, shifting from brilliant orange to a sickly, pale yellow. "It's the fire!" a bridge officer shrieked, its multi-jointed limbs spasming. "The uncontrolled thermal outgassing. It's producing this deadly toxin. Their own destructive force is suffocating them." Below, the humans weren't panicking. Not in the way the Cathar were. Jarek, the large human, stood by the fire pit, his brow furrowed. He didn't seem affected by the invisible gas directly, but his eyes were fixed on the struggling flames. Mia, the young human, coughed. A small, involuntary sound, but didn't cry out. The other humans, those who had just seen Jarek cauterize his wound with a superheated stone, now looked around, their expressions not of terror, but of deep, shared concern. Jarek didn't waste time. "Air's getting thin," he rumbled, his voice low but clear through the ship's audio pickup. "Fire's choking, heavy gas coming in low." He pointed to the side of the camp, towards a slight depression in the terrain. "Clear a trench here, deep and wide. Get that stuff moving." Immediately, the other humans sprang into action. They didn't question, didn't hesitate. They grabbed their fire-hardened sticks and the jagged stone fragments they'd created, not as weapons, but as crude digging tools. With an almost desperate urgency, they began to carve a shallow ditch, pushing the disturbed earth and debris away from the camp, creating a clear channel. The silence on the Cathar bridge was absolute, broken only by the frantic sounds of human digging and Silly's labored breathing. As the trench took shape, Jarek began to gather armfuls of dry, fibrous brush and dead leaves. He didn't throw them into the main fire. Instead, he carefully placed them nascabras along the newly dug trench, extending away from the camp. Then, with a brand from the main fire, he ignited this new line of fuel. A fresh series of smaller, more localized fires erupted, a fiery channel extending from their main hearth. The flames, though smaller, burned with a fierce, concentrated heat. And then Xylar saw it. The pale, yellow flicker of the main fire began to regain its orange vibrancy. The heavier gas, drawn by the new, aggressive thermal current created by the trench fires, was being pulled away, out of the hollow of the camp, pushed along the channel, and into the open air where it dispersed. "Captain, the contaminant levels are dropping," Xylar gasped, its respiratory readings stabilizing. "The human-induced thermal currents are creating a localized ventilation effect. They are burning off the unbreathable atmosphere, actively manipulating air currents with fire. Xylar watched as Jarek, now breathing freely, wiped sweat from his brow. He didn't look heroic. He looked like a mechanic who'd just fixed a stubborn engine. The humans had taken an unseen killer, a silent thief of breath, and used the very element his species feared to burn it out of existence. They hadn't just endured, they had understood the unseen, and with fire they had fought back against the very air.